The bass. Woo! Woo! Yeah!
And hello. Right, let me just put something in my ear. You won't be able to hear it, but I need background sound while I'm doing this. Apologies, first off, for not having done Mappa Monday for a couple of weeks, 3 weeks, I think. I'd love to say there was a reason for the whole of that, but unfortunately there were like 3 different reasons. One of which was literally just that I slept through the period when I should have been doing Mappa Monday. The wonders of the wonders of apparently not being able to speak the English language despite having been born to the wonders of chronic depression and chronic depression and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, both of which regularly cause insomnia. So yeah, shit, as they say, happens. Anyway, today not necessarily going to do as much actual mapping today as is normal, hence the primary reason why I'm using this screen layout at the moment rather than the one with just me in a corner, tiny, because the focus on that is very much on the map. But as the title suggests, I want to concentrate today on dungeon mapping, and a lot of that is going to be in terms of the philosophy behind making dungeons. So hello to Chrono Magistrate, to Commodore Z, and to Rookie 2907. Welcome aboard. Good to see you all here. Nice to know that even when I leave it alone for a few weeks, I can still get people drop in and watch. That's always reassuring. Okay, that voice attack actually worked for a change and also greeted you, but unfortunately you can't hear that because I haven't got that routed through to the channel. At some point I'll get that working well enough that I feel comfortable actually letting people hear him. Because at the moment, Dreadnought just says a lot of nonsense at the wrong times. Anyway, dungeon maps. Obviously, dungeon maps are a big part of a lot of people's gaming experience. And there's a big difference in the way dungeons are mapped for different games, including different versions of the same game. If you go back to early dungeons, let's just grab the one I'm running at the moment. This is green, so it doesn't really work very well when I'm on a green screen. Okay, so this is the Palace of the Silver Princess, Dungeon Module B3 for not even Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. I'm running it in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, but this is for basic Dungeons and Dragons. And this dungeon map looks like that. This was how modules were done in those days. You get a cardboard cover on the module which isn't attached and therefore works like a GM screen with the map on the inside when you're actually running, which was a really neat idea. I liked that. So often nowadays modules are done in hardback books and either don't have that at all or have the maps just on pages as you go through, and they're much less easy to use in my opinion. So what this module consists of, the way this dungeon map is laid out, is it's got 2 levels, an upper and a lower level. And you come in on the lower level. This is the opposite way around to the way a lot of dungeons work in those days. You come in on the lower level and you find your way up to the upper level. And the upper level is the actual palace itself. The lower level is like the basements. So you can see that. Again, I can't see how well you can see that without looking on the other monitor. But that gives you an idea. That's what we're dealing with the map for that era. As you can see, that is far from a modern battle map style dungeon. It doesn't have all of the detail and colour and nice flashy art that you would see in a modern dungeon map. because, I hate to say it, modern gamers, but gameplay in those days was a lot more narrative, a lot more what people tend to refer to these days as theatre of the mind. A lot of modern gamers assume that's a modern invention, that theatre of the mind was what's done now. They've now invented theatre of the mind, where it was all about moving minis and murder hoboing back in the old days. But other than D&D's heritage coming from originally tabletop wargaming to develop the system, it was the other way around, because you didn't have maps. These were maps not for playing on. These were maps so that the GM could see what the dungeon looked like, and they were described to the players. So rather than, as I'm running it now using a modern VTT, I put the players on the map and they can walk down the corridor, move their tokens down the corridor and see what's there. But in the old days, it would have been, okay, so the corridor stretches ahead of you going west for 70 feet before turning left and heading south. All directions being map relative rather than actual directions. And even when you came into a room, the modules had room descriptions and you would describe the room rather than letting the players see what the room looks like on the map. So maps were used very differently then to what they are now. And that made a difference in how you designed the maps. Because if you're designing a map to put tokens on, and particularly if you're designing a map that maybe you're going to print out and put figures on to play, that map needs to look very different. So theatre of the mind or narrative gameplay makes a big difference to how dungeons are designed. Also, dungeons tended to be bigger in those days. This is a fairly small dungeon. It's only got the 2 layers. There's a limited number of rooms on it. But I actually did compare it a while back in a blog post I never published, partly because I thought it would just annoy too many people. I compared it to the Lost Mines of Phandelver module, the original 5th edition starter box. And it turns that box contains something like 5 different locations with the encounters spread across those locations, and still I think worked out at about the same number of rooms as this single location dungeon from 1981, I think. So dungeons tended to be bigger in those days. If you look at some of the things like, say, the Temple of Elemental Evil, that was a large dungeon in its day and would be considered a mega dungeon by modern standards. Whereas the actual mega dungeons, like, for example, Undermountain in the Forgotten Realms, or Castle Whitelock by Goodman Games, which was originally released for 3rd edition, and they're now doing a 5th edition and Dungeon Crawl Classics version of it. These things are absolutely vast, with levels numbered in the teens and an awful lot. Rapanathuk is another one that actually has ridiculous numbers of levels. Costs a small fortune to buy the whole thing because of the number of levels that it has when you split down between the different levels. But you can run literally an entire campaign within one mega dungeon if you're okay with your characters never seeing the sun. If it's well designed, there's enough variety in the different locations that you can do that. You can see behind me the first level of a mega dungeon I started designing, which one day I may publish, but I've never actually played anything in this mega dungeon yet to be able to do so. But going back to the basics of dungeon design, first thing that you really have to consider when designing your dungeon is you have to look at the context. Context is king in almost everything, and that's the same with mapping. So there's a number of ways that dungeon designs come about. The first way is fairly obvious and probably the most common form these days, which is that you've got an adventure, you want to set it in a dungeon, so you have to write a dungeon to put that adventure in. Particularly if you're playing something like 5th edition, where leveling is so fast, and there are a limited number of encounters in your dungeon. You probably have all the encounters worked out in advance. When you created your scenario, your adventure, you probably worked out who the big boss was, what the big boss fight was going to be, him, however many henchmen and minions, worked that all out, and then you worked out a number of encounters to build up to him possibly designed to level the PCs to the right place to take on the boss at the end. And when you did that, you had this list of encounters. So all you need now is a dungeon to plug them into. That obviously makes your dungeon design that much easier, because all you've got to do is you say, I've got 6 encounters, so I need a minimum of 6 rooms. But that's not going to be good enough, because that's going to be a very boring, no matter how exciting the fights are, it's going to be a very boring adventure, because you literally just go into this room, have a fight, into this room, have a fight, into this room, have a fight, maybe into this room and have an encounter with a trap or a puzzle or something instead. But an encounter in every room gets very predictable. So you've got to increase by 50% at least the number of rooms that you have. So if you've got your 6 encounters, you're going to want at least 9 rooms. Probably you're going to want more like 12 rooms. The more encounters you've got, the lower the number of extra rooms you can put in, you need to put in, becomes. If you've only got 6 encounters, 9 rooms, that's not a lot of empty rooms going along. And the rooms are probably, unless you've got big corridors, the rooms are going to be close enough together that you're very much risking the PCs hitting multiple encounters at once. That is something that needs to be considered when you're doing dungeon design. If you've got a cool fight in room 6 and another cool fight in room 7, and room 7 is right next door to room 6, unless there is some reason why the sound doesn't carry, that's one big fight, that's not 2 fights. It's got to be some reason why whichever room they go into first doesn't result in both fights. That said, you can make a really good encounter that way. You build the encounter at the big fight, and then what you do is you split it in 2 or even maybe 3, and you place it in 3 different rooms, each with their own unique feel. This is particularly good if it's a module that you want to run. Say it's a module that you're planning on publishing, or it's a module that you want to run for different groups at different times. Maybe it's a convention module, or just that you've got different groups and you're feeling lazy and want to give them each of them the same module instead of running them all through completely unique ones. So what you do is you put your 3 portions of the encounter in the 3 rooms, and you literally run the whole encounter in whichever room they enter first, and then you just stage the reinforcements coming in. So they start out fighting who's in the room. That's great. Maybe at the end of round 1, the door bursts open, and revealing the creatures from room 2. During room 2, they move in and join the fight. So the players better be doing a good job. They better be watching their flank, for example, and/or they better be taking people out quickly because the reinforcements are coming. And then at the end of maybe round 2, or perhaps if you're feeling generous, round 3, and as GM, of course, you can decide this on the fly as you go. The door to the next room opens, and they come running in. And you've built this as one big encounter that you know they should be able to handle. But it puts the pressure on the players, because from their point of view, they're hitting 3 encounters at once. And they don't need to know that's not right. That's not how it was designed. And if you're running it for 3 different groups, you can even try to steer the groups towards a different room each, so they all have the same fight in a different environment. And you can have that environment change the way the fight works. And this is all really good stuff for making the encounters more interesting and making the dungeon more interesting. Getting perhaps a little bit into advanced dungeon design there, but it's also just basic scenario design. And this style of dungeon design, where you're writing a scenario first, then you're putting it into a dungeon, is very well suited to that. So you work out how many rooms you're going to need for the encounters that you've got, then you put in some extra rooms. I would recommend at that point putting in some non-conflict encounters, because an encounter can be anything. It doesn't have to be just a fight or a puzzle or a trap. It can be literally anything that the players interact with is an encounter. So if you have a room, for example, that has a permanent darkness on it, that's an encounter. It doesn't need to be anything in there. Even if there's no fight, that's an encounter on its own, because they've got to figure out how they're going to get through it. Do they have magic that they can use to get through it? If not, how are they going to keep track of each other in case there is a fight in the room? And it doesn't actually threaten the characters because there's nothing there to hurt them. But at the same time, it produces the impression of threat because they've got a plan for what if there is a monster in this. In particular, what if there is a monster in this that can see through the darkness? Which is getting into, if you really hate your player characters and you want to terrify them, then by all means put a monster that can see through the darkness in there and have some fun with it. Just make sure they've got a way of surviving somehow. But these kind of encounters that make the players think and make the players interact with the scenario, but without them just picking up their dice and rolling to hit, or trying to solve a puzzle, these can be a very good way of livening up the adventure. You can add a few XP, an XP value to it for good measure if there's something to seriously solve. Just overcoming the fact that this is a dark room isn't necessarily worth any XP, though they might get roleplay experience points for running through it, or they might get idea experience points if they come up with a good way of getting through safely. But it doesn't necessarily, the room itself doesn't necessarily have to have an experience value, but it could have if you wanted it to, if you just want to give some extra XP to your characters. And also, as I said, it breaks up the dungeon a little bit. It makes it not just walk into a room, have a fight, loot the treasure, walk into the next room, or walk into a room, dodge the trap, loot the treasure, walk into the next room, or walk into a room, solve the puzzle, walk into the next room, collect whatever the puzzle gives you. These are all good room types, but they get samey if you've got a big dungeon. So some rooms that are empty and some rooms that have non-conflict encounters help to shake that up. Keep the thing interesting. Not a traditional dungeon, but thinking of when I ran Coriolis, the Third Horizon, as opposed to the new Coriolis game, which is Coriolis the Great Dark, that's just come out, or it's either just come out or it's on pre-order. I can't remember what the launch date was. When I ran the quick start for Coriolis the Third Horizon, that's set on a space station. It's a space station that is largely abandoned and disaster has happened, and it's overrun with this creepy plant growth. And I didn't have a station map. There wasn't a station map for it, and I didn't draw one. I decided not to bother with that. And I ran it as a dungeon adventure, essentially. I knew what was in there. I knew what was in specific locations, because there was an illustration of the station, and it pointed out the different areas and where the specific rooms that you need to interact with in the scenario were. But it didn't map things like the corridors and other rooms in between. So I ad-libbed that. I made that up as I went along, running along, and I ran it like a dungeon adventure. So there was a lot of walking down corridors, listening for sounds, hearing things, getting spooked. And even though if you streamline the adventure on that quick start, you can easily go through it in a single session. If, for example, you say, okay, make me a roll to navigate the station, you find engineering, whatever. If that's how you want to play it, you can do it that way, and it gets you through very quickly, and you can run the whole thing in a session. I think I did it in 3, if I remember rightly, and there was a lot of walking along creepy corridors, which I was quite happy with at the time. So a lot of essentially non-conflict encounters, because all it was admittedly the plant life was kind of semi-intelligent and evil, but it wasn't actively trying to kill them necessarily. And there was a lot of creeping through that, which kept the players interesting. It kept them on edge. And I was quite happy with that, because that's not something I'm particularly good at, and it worked quite well on that occasion. But at the same time, it was different from the encounters with the remaining people that were in there. So even though there wasn't a dungeon map involved in that, I was still using that same technique of putting in the non-conflict encounters between the encounter rooms, essentially. So that's the first style of dungeon design, is when you've got a scenario and then you just need a map to put it into. And using the term dungeon map very loosely here, that could be anything from an underground complex to a castle to a manor to a street. If you think of the buildings in a street, or at least the major rooms within those buildings, each as rooms of a dungeon, you can use a street as a dungeon. And you can look at video games to see how this works very nicely. Things like, for example, Oh, I can't remember the name of it. I should have taken a pill before this stream. Um, there's two of them. There's a guy with a mystic mask that came from The Outsider. It's got on a tabletop RPG these days, but very very successful game. But anyway, that, at least the first one of them, that used this technique with streets. And what it did is it effectively sealed off the street. You only had one or two ways in and out of the street. And you could get into some of the buildings in that street. So both the street itself and some of the buildings around that street served essentially as a dungeon map. And you can do that in your own games. So, you can write your scenario and decide not to put it into a traditional dungeon, but to put it into something like that. You could put it into a village, where instead of walking down corridors, they're walking around the open space between buildings, and the encounters are in specific buildings within that village. If it's a small village, there might only be a dozen or so buildings. If you put an encounter in half of those, you've got essentially a dungeon, an open-air dungeon, that will serve all of the normal purposes of a dungeon bar one. The only thing it doesn't give you is that it doesn't lock the players in. There are ways even of doing that. You can have a limited area in a city under quarantine, for example. It's barricaded off. You can't get out of this area, but there's something in the area that you need to find. So you're undertaking that dungeon adventure, and then you've got the whole thing. You are in a sealed area. You can move around to find location-based encounters within that area. And at the same time, and this is something people tend to forget about dungeons, is dungeons don't have to be location-based encounters. You can write an event-based scenario and place it in a dungeon. All you have to do is not key the events to specific locations. What I mean by an event-based scenario, it's the kind of stuff that Zed runs, watching, and I need to catch up on that. I've done the first few episodes, but I haven't watched any for a couple of weeks. On his Vampire Saxon Age game, that's event-based gaming. So it's not that when I go to room Y, I meet monster X. It's these things will happen in probably this order, but there's obviously room to shuffle them around based on what the player characters are doing. And you can do that in a dungeon environment perfectly well. Instead of having, this is the room with the kobolds, this is the room with the orcs, this is the room with the pit trap, you say, these are the encounters to be met. Maybe you decide the order in which they're going to be met. Maybe you don't. Probably, the sensible thing is what you've done is you've got maybe 2 or 3 key encounters and a number of unimportant encounters that can go anywhere at all. And the key encounters you're going to hit in that order. But then, based on what's happening in your game, you spice things up by throwing in the encounters in between, the other secondary unimportant encounters. So perhaps you want to welcome the group to the dungeon, so maybe your first encounter happens straight away at the dungeon entrance. But if, on the other hand, the players are ready, if the players are expecting an encounter in that first room, then maybe instead you say, right, well, we'll give them a couple of empty rooms, let them slightly calm down, get off their guard, then we'll throw that first encounter in like the 4th room that they go in, say. And provided that the rooms have space for the encounter, that's the only requirement. You can put the encounters anywhere you want, provided they will fit in that room. And again, you can have rooms with different environments in them. You might have one room that's got a cavern across the center, a chasm across the center where there's been an earthquake. You might have another room where a corner of the dungeon has collapsed in, and there's rubble and debris everywhere, making movement difficult. Obviously, those 2 rooms are both based on the idea that this is an underground dungeon which has at some point in the past suffered an earthquake. And then, based on how you feel like running the encounters, you shove an encounter in there. So this room has a lot of debris on the floor. It makes movement a little bit difficult. There's a lot of danger, difficult terrain, and also a lot of things to hide behind. So I'm going to shove my kobold archers in there, scatter them around the room. Or, if the players are having a hard time, maybe I'll put them in the room with the chasm, where they're on the far side of the chasm and they think they're safe. But if the player characters also have ranged attacks and or spells, they're actually out in the open with no cover, and they get slaughtered pretty quickly. It's just that then the PCs have to figure out how to cross the chasm and to loot the bodies. So dungeons don't have to be fixed. You can do a lot with them without fixing them. So that's really that's where we get on to the second type of dungeon. The second type of dungeon is, rather than here is an adventure, I need a space to put it in, you get into, here is a space I can put an adventure in. And from a mapping point of view, I highly recommend making those. I'm not saying they're better by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm saying that as map makers, they're better. Because what you're doing there is, instead of just making a map for the scenario you've written and only making the maps you need, what you can do instead is you can sit down and you can just start mapping dungeons, or towns, or streets, or whatever it is you want to practice mapping. And if you don't like the map, you discard the map. If you do like the map, it goes into your file of maps to be used at a later time. And then either you can write a scenario that specifically fits that map, or you can pick that map up because it will work for a scenario idea that you've got anyway. The other use that you can do with those, of course, besides plugging scenarios into them, is you can literally have them the classically old school, what a lot of modern gamers think all the old school dungeons were like, and you can just populate the dungeon and have it as literally nothing more than an area full of rooms with encounters in, and the encounters don't necessarily have to make sense. If every adventure is like that, people are going to get very fed up with the games. But if they've had a lot of very plot heavy adventures, or even only a couple of plot heavy adventures, but they have been plot heavy, then a situation just where they're literally just walking in and clearing out the nonsense that's in there can be fun. It's a nice lightweight thing, it takes the pressure off, and it's a good use for these pre-built, pre-drawn dungeons, which at the same time, drawing them improves your skills, whether you are drawing by hand or whether you're drawing on a computer with whatever software. The only thing that doesn't improve your skills is if you're using a random dungeon generator. If you're just pressing a button and a dungeon pops out, you can produce a dozen dungeons and you can use them exactly the same way in game, but you will get no better at making dungeons. You might get better at filling them if you fill them all because of the practice, but you won't get better at drawing dungeons if you're just generating them randomly that way. And there is a random dungeon generator, in fact, for Campaign Cartographer. You can give it some information and have it pop up a geomorph-based dungeon. Essentially, you just slap some tiles in and gives you a dungeon that you can then edit like any other file. So you can still then tweak it and put your own data into it and turn it into a fully fledged dungeon if you're in a hurry. But there's a lot of things that will do that. There's a lot of dungeon generators, both online, mostly online. It's got to be said, there's a number of websites you can go to and just say, give me a dungeon, and it'll give you a dungeon. And in some cases, it'll even populate that dungeon for you, but then you're really learning nothing. That's great for, I need a dungeon right now to run, but you don't learn anything about designing games. You don't learn anything about writing scenarios, about drawing dungeons, about populating dungeons. All you learn about is running the individual encounters. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's what you want. If you're beginning GM and you just want to put some people through a dungeon, run some fights, get the hang of the combat system, brilliant. By all means, use one. But I highly recommend drawing maps when you don't need to. Draw maps for the sake of drawing maps, because then that's when your mapping skills improve. And there's a number of ways they can improve, obviously. For someone like me who can't draw for toffee, using Campaign Cartographer to draw my maps, it's the use of the software that is improving primarily. I'm learning what it can do and how to achieve the effects that I want. But at the same time, my creative mapping skills improve alongside it. Because I think of things, I go, what if? And I experiment with stuff. And then once I've experimented with it and done it once, I know it can be done. And I may not remember exactly how I did it, but I'll know that I did do it. And at a later date, a scenario might scream out and say, that thing you did on a random dungeon like 3 weeks ago, just because you wanted to see if it would work, and it did. That would work so well in this adventure, so draw that in here now. So don't just draw dungeons when you need a dungeon. Draw dungeons for the sake of drawing dungeons, whether that be on computer, on paper. The number of unused dungeons that I have made over the years is quite a lot, both on just squared paper, sitting doodling with a pen, and also on campaign cartographer, learning how to use the software. It's an important skill, in my opinion, and the same goes for all forms of mapping. So if you want a really good overland map for your campaign, don't expect the first map that you draw to be a really good overland map. You could get lucky, it might be. But it's more likely that if you've drawn half a dozen maps for the sake of drawing maps of various continental regions, then when you sit down with an idea in mind, wanting to create a particular map, you'll produce something better because you've got the experience. And hello, Alia, welcome aboard. As I said at the top of the stream, I probably am going to do some actual mapping, but less than I normally do on a Mappa Monday, because today a lot of what I'm doing here is just talking about how you go about drawing maps, specifically in this case dungeon maps, while drinking tea from my new ADHD&D mug, which I was forced to buy on Saturday. Druttercup and I went to a convention on Saturday, had a good time, spent too much money on games. But I was forced to buy this mug because this has the slogan ADHD&D, roll for concentration. And just to be wonderfully ironic, it also has a Nat 1 illustrated on it, which is about right. Thing is, I was wearing a t-shirt with ADHD&D, roll for concentration, and a die showing a Nat 1 when I went. I may have worn it on, I probably have worn it on stream at some point before, so you may have seen it, but I was wearing a t-shirt that, different artwork, but otherwise matched this mug, so when I saw the mug, I just had to buy it. It was one of those things, had to be done. Oh, welcome indeed. So that was part 2 of, or type 2 of dungeon mapping, is Hello Drut, is when I was just talking about you, don't know whether you came in time to hear the end of it, explaining the new mug, and that we had a good day on Saturday. And by the way, happy birthday, Drut. Everybody wish Druttercup a happy birthday, because that is her birthday today. Right now, Drut is even older than she was before. That's the correct way to phrase that, yeah? That's how I say that, I'm sure. So yeah, happy birthday, Drut. I hope you're having a good one so far. And so yeah, first type of dungeon mapping, you have a scenario, you need a map to put it in. Second type of dungeon mapping, you have a map and you populate it either with a scenario written specifically for it, or you use it because it fits a scenario you have in mind, or you just fill it with encounters as a essentially plot-free, lightweight dungeoneering experience, which can be a fun way to play. That's the first two types of dungeon mapping. The third type, I suppose, has to be something which goes back, as far as I'm aware, goes back to this book. Obviously it must predate this book, because the system in this book has to have been written and used before they put it into the book. But this is the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide, and it has, in Appendix 1, it has a random dungeon generation system. So the idea behind that was that you would roll up, you make random rolls for corridors, rooms, etc., and indeed for the contents of those rooms. And you could either do that in advance. It took a bit of time to build a dungeon that way, but you could, if you were just utterly starved for creativity and just really couldn't think of anything interesting to do, you could just roll it randomly. Or you could do a mix. If you had 2 or 3 ideas that you knew you wanted to put into a dungeon but not enough for a whole dungeon, you could roll up a random dungeon inserting those ideas as you wanted. And it had, of course, the random monster tables, room contents tables and random monster tables to fill that dungeon with neat stuff for people to kill and steal money from, essentially. And you can do that either in advance, as I say, or you can do it on the fly. You can actually just start out with a piece of paper, draw the opening to your dungeon, and it's great for solo dungeoning because you can just go in and it's plot-free solo dungeoning. It doesn't have to be, of course. What you can do, for example, is you can get a piece of paper, you can draw your start. Good way of doing it is take 3 pieces of paper. Draw your start on one piece of paper, draw your finish with a boss monster on a second piece of paper, and then randomize the dungeon in between until you feel you've got enough. And then just, rather than saying it has to reach the edge of the piece of paper and meet the third one that has the boss monster's room in, you can do it the other way round. You can say, right, I've had enough. This corridor here will lead to that corridor on my end game piece of paper. We'll just overlay that onto this map here, and bingo, that's where I reach the end. So you can in fact have a dungeon with random contents, but with a plot and a specific ending to it, defeating the evil wizard or whatever. This system actually does kind of show up one of the things that I was talking about, that dungeon sizes are quite different from the old days. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this. Those are the starting areas for dungeons. So using this system, you use one of those, you put that onto your piece of paper, and that's the start of your dungeon. And then from there, as you leave those areas, you randomly generate rooms and corridors going on from there. Slightly oddly, there's 5 of them. I might have been inclined myself to do 6 so that I could roll a d6 to randomize which one I'm using. But for some reason, they didn't do that. But then from there, you have table 1 is a periodic check, which is basically when you're walking down a corridor, you periodically roll this to see what happens next, and you can get continue straight ahead. You can get a door, a side passage. The passage turns. You hit a chamber. You hit stairs. You hit a dead end. You hit a trick or trap, or you hit a wandering monster. And that's at its simplest level. That's really all it needs. There's a lot more detail than other tables after that, but at its basic level, that is literally all you need. Just keep walking down the corridor and roll to see when it hits another corridor, when it hits a room, when it hits a trap, when it hits a wandering monster. There you go. You've got a random dungeon. Simple as. And that was where it started. But it's carried on. There have been so many random dungeon generation systems created over the years. Hell, I did one myself. Although I never finished the random layout portion of it. My system primarily covers room contents. Although there is a system, but it requires more GM input than a lot of them do. And mine is designed. This is partly because mine is designed to create consistent dungeons to some extent. I put a lot of work into an unpublished system for building dungeons that made sense, because a lot of dungeons, even if they're not random, don't make sense. I like my dungeons to make sense, so I started trying to automate that, and it works. It doesn't work as well. It's not perfect. It does not work brilliantly, but it does work. And one day maybe it'll get published. It was originally supposed to be published in a dungeon bashing supplement for my Obsession RPG called Simple Fantasy, which was supposed to be just the basics of what you needed for fantasy roleplay, but with this random dungeon system. Then that project grew in the telling and never got published in the end, because I just kept wanting to put more and more into it, and it split so that I had a number of planned books, and I moved the random dungeon generation into one of those books, and the whole thing never got published in the end because I do this stuff. One day, maybe it will. The current version of that project is a standalone RPG using the Obsession system still, called Legends of the First, which is based on the idea that the mythology that I wrote for the setting, Chthona, includes what are known as the First Race. And the First Race are the progenitors of the elves, look like elves but are not are actually truly immortal, like Tolkien elves, rather than long-lived like every other game's elves, and are hugely powerful. And although most races have long since forgotten it, are essentially the gods of the player character races. But most don't know that. They have forgotten this, and indeed that the first race ever existed. But there are a few still out there in the world, waiting for the big epic adventures. So yeah, who knows? Maybe I'll get that written one day and publish it. Maybe I won't. Either way, if I do, it will involve dungeons, such as the one on screen at the moment. This is the upper levels, level 1 of the upper levels of what I call the Tunnels of Testing, which is my version of Undermountain. It sits underneath the city of Red Helm's Peak, and this was designed using that system. And what I did, it's got a quite cunning system to handle mega dungeons like this. What I did was I thought a mega dungeon can be seen as a number of smaller dungeons. So having got a random system for creating dungeons, I said, what if you use that system and you scaled it by saying each of the rooms in this random dungeon is a complete dungeon? And this, of course, can be applied to any random dungeon system. So, if you've got a system you like to use to generate dungeons and you want to build a mega dungeon, think about doing it that way. Think about rolling whatever the results are for producing the size of your dungeon. And instead of having that be rooms, build each of those as a separate dungeon that connects to the others. And then you've got a mega dungeon. So, level 1, the upper levels of the Tunnels of Testing, consists of 3 levels. Section 1, the upper levels, consists of 3 levels, and I've only mapped level 1 in the end because I never actually played anything on it, and it's difficult to motivate yourself to make that big a map twice unless you've at least used the first one first. But one of the things that I did with that, and I've got a note here, there are 12 blank corridors, including 2 blank staircases leading from the Dwarfish anti-block on that map. And so we can see one here on the west side, one up here on the top, there's another one just below that, again going west. And the idea is that each of those blank corridors leads to a dungeon block, which is the term that I was using for what would have been a normal dungeon being a room, but here is a complete dungeon, so that you can plug your own dungeons in to fill those dungeon blocks. And I created it. Level 1 has 10 entrances, which includes 2 leading to Red Helm's Peak, the city above, and 8 others that go somewhere. They might go to other dungeons, they might go up to Red Helm's Peak, they might go to underground tunnels somewhere. That's undefined. But the number of entrances and exits is part of the way I used the system for working out how big the dungeon was going to be. So every time you add an entrance, you increase the size of the dungeon by a number of rooms. So this had a base size of 6 blocks, but with 10 entrances, that added a total of 27 more for 33 blocks. Adding 7 more undefined entrances gives us 21 more for a total of 54. So, yeah, okay. 54 blocks. Some of which aren't on the map, some of which are to be plugged in later to customize the map. But each of those 54 blocks is essentially a dungeon. So then what I did was I broke up the map. I created it block by block, essentially. I actually, because there's 2 ways you can do this. You can either draw the map, then determine what it is, or you can determine the size of the map and draw it accordingly. I used a combination of the 2 for this. A lot of that map was just drawn for the sake of drawing and then split up. And the dungeons themselves are relatively small, though it does vary. So, for example, Block EA has 23 rooms, 6 entrances, all of which are tunnels. Whereas, on the other hand, block EJ has a single entrance and only 5 rooms. It's kind of like a dead-end dungeon, essentially. So quite variable in terms of what's there. The coding there was down to effectively where they connect. So I've got a west entrance and an east entrance. So anything with a W code connects. You access it through the west entrance. Anything with an E code you access through the east entrance. They do of course connect together, so it's all still all one big dungeon, but it's how you most immediately get to them for that. And yeah, what I did is I worked out just the dungeon sizes for each of these and marked them on the map accordingly. So if I zoom in on a portion of the map, we can see this. Let's actually zoom in on the center of the map. So right here, WE1, that's, surprise, surprise, that's the west entrance. Room 1 of the west entrance. And that's what's called a fixed block. The 2 entrance blocks are what's called fixed blocks. And those are basically, the content of those are set. Whereas the others are mostly not fixed blocks. They are dungeon blocks to be filled by the GM. So this was created as a mega dungeon, but a mega dungeon that you built yourself according to what you wanted as you went along. And it's just one way of doing it. So enough about that. Let's talk more about generic dungeon building rather than this specific dungeon building. The style on this, by the way, is also a hybrid, because this is obviously inspired by the old school dungeon maps like this, but using the 5 foot per square scale that modern dungeon maps use. The 5 foot per square scale came in for battle maps, for putting miniatures on. Old school dungeons, Invisi dungeons, old school dungeons were 10 foot squares on the dungeon maps, because they weren't intended to be used for battle maps. They were just to indicate where the dungeon was. And unless there was some specific reason why something needed to be less than a full square in width, everything was based on a 10 foot square. So you had 10 foot wide corridors. You still do in most dungeons. You know, double square corridors is standard for most dungeons these days. So this style is the clean lines of the old school dungeon design without all of the clutter filling up the rooms, but with the 5 foot scale that people expect nowadays. And I find that actually works quite nicely for basic dungeon design. You might want to go through and make battle maps of specific areas that encounters are taking place in. But just for having a working dungeon map, it doesn't need to be more complicated than this. I mean, obviously this has been prettied up a little bit by Campaign Cartographer. If I turn off the effects, we can see that that's what it looks like without any effects. Looking like that, you can actually see this map on my coffee page. And speaking of my coffee page, I don't normally do this, but I'm going to say today, I am actually going to say I have a coffee page. There's not a great deal of content on it. Some of my maps are on there though, and they're downloadable from there. And that is at Coffee. There's a link. In fact, just a little bit up the in the chat, there is a link to it. It's Coffee. That's ko-fi.com/fish-not-fish. And there you can see some of my musings, and you can see some of my maps that you can download, and also you can of course buy me a virtual coffee. Just click a button and make a small payment, which comes to me. I don't normally point this out. This isn't really this is not a commercial channel, but I've just had an expensive weekend buying games at Canterbury Gamescom. So yeah, it'd be nice to make some of that money back if anybody did feel like throwing a few shekels my way. So we've got dungeons that you draw to fit your scenario. We've got dungeons that you draw and then you fit a scenario or a set of encounters to it. We've got random dungeons. Those are probably our 3 main forms of dungeon building. Branching off here and there into just interesting little side ideas, like I was saying about maybe using a village and treating it as if it was a dungeon, using a portion of a town or city, a street, for example, and running that like a dungeon. You can use the basic principles of dungeon design and dungeon adventuring in different areas, not just a dungeon. And this is extending an idea that started long ago. Because the early dungeons were dungeons, and then they started getting a little bit more imaginative with them. So you might have a dungeon map, for example, that's actually a castle or a large building. Thinking of things like, things like Palace of the Silver Princess, where the top portion of that is a slightly damaged, but nevertheless a castle keep. Secret of the Slaver's Stockade, that was a castle. There were dungeons underneath, yes, but the bulk of the dungeon was the castle itself. Curse of Strahd, the original Ravenloft adventure. That was Castle Ravenloft. That adventure was set in a castle, a dungeon that was a castle. And then you take it from there. You say, okay, so a dungeon doesn't need to be underground. It can be a building like a castle above ground. And then from there you start expanding out, well, what else? What is a dungeon when you really think about it? A dungeon is just a set of encounter locations that are connected together, that may or may not be sealed against the outside world, so that the adventurers are kind of stuck within or have limited exits. Palace of the Silver Princess, they're literally stuck within. Once they get inside, they can't get back out until they've solved the riddle of the what's going on in the palace. Whereas most dungeons, you can always backtrack to the entrance that you came in, and old school dungeons very often were managed that way. Oh, look, there's my coffee link again. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge, wink, wink. Say no more. So it was quite standard to go in and clear a portion of the dungeon, then come back out, sell off the loot, rest, heal up. This was particularly done, of course, in old school games where the healing rate was so much lower. If you can take an 8-hour rest in 5th edition, then you're back up fully restored. You've got all your spells, all your hit points, everything. If you go back to old school D&D, you'd get a hit point back. If the GM was generous, you'd get a hit point back for resting up. You'd get your spells back, but 1 hit point. So it was all down to, before going into a rest, how many healing spells can we cast before we rest, then get them all back in the morning, and you hope that you don't get ambushed in the middle of the night, breaking your rest period, ruining your rest, and having no clerical spells to be able to spiritual hammer or whatever the bad guys with. So yeah, they were cruel in the old days, dungeons, very cruel, but fun. So we talked about a couple of things that dungeons could be instead of a traditional dungeon. Another classic one, as used way back in the early 1980s by, I think, Sir Ian Livingstone, as he is now, was the idea of a forest as a dungeon. And I think the third Fighting Fantasy game book, might have been the second, but I think it was the third Fighting Fantasy game book, was entitled Forest of Doom. It's an excellent adventure which took place in a forest. And it works exactly like any other dungeon, because you're still limited in your movement, because there's areas of underbrush that you can't walk through. Between the trees and the bushes and brambles and things, you are limited to specific paths through. So it works exactly like a dungeon. And there are streamlined dungeon mapping techniques that can be used for situations like this, where characters have got to pass through an area of undergrowth like this. And one of those techniques is to adapt a mind mapping technique. Now, if you're familiar with mind mapping, brilliant. Essentially what mind mapping is doing is you're putting little circles connected together by lines, and generally when you're mind mapping, what you'll do is you will make notes. So you might start out with one idea in the middle, and you write down that idea, and then you get another idea connected to that, so you write that off to one side, put a circle around the two of them, and put a line connecting the two, and then they branch off like that. But that basic structure can be used to create a streamlined dungeon. In fact, I've seen, this is quite good advice, I've seen the advice given to keep a few randomly drawn mind maps with just blank circles, because you can use them for all kinds of things when you need to improvise in your game. So, need a dungeon, each of those circles is a room. The lines between the corridors connecting them may not be a straight corridor, maybe a windy corridor, that doesn't matter. Your map still shows that those are connected. And if you want to, you can always draw a few extra lines coming off the lines themselves to make it more, to give it more of a labyrinth of corridors around it. But just turn your mind map, bang, into a dungeon. Very convenient. Players don't need to know that it wasn't all mapped out beautifully in advance, unless they're expecting you to actually present them with a map for the thing. If you're running it narratively, they're never going to know. You can also use that mind map for other things, like it could be the structure of the local thieves guild. It could be a web of connection between NPCs in a murder mystery. All kinds of things that you can use that for. So it is a good idea. I don't actually use it myself, but it is a good technique just to keep a few randomly drawn mind maps, these connection webs lying around that you can just pull one out and use when you need it. I prefer to draw them on the fly myself, but it's still a good suggestion. On the subject of streamlining dungeons, that's obviously one way of streamlining dungeon design, is just not to draw out the whole dungeon, just to draw the key points and connect them. And there's a few ways you can do that. In addition to this technique using the mind mapping, you can do it in more traditional sense by just using a squared piece of paper, for example, and you draw the entrance onto it, and then at another point you draw in a few encounters, whatever encounters you want. I mean, this can be a good way of starting to design your dungeon. Going back to System 1, where you have a scenario and you want to put it into a dungeon, you've got your encounters already worked out. So what you can do is you can, if you are placing them in specific locations, you can create those locations and then decide how they connect together afterwards. Maybe even decide how they connect together while you're running it. You could have a piece of paper that just has half a dozen islands, each of which consists of one or more rooms that contain that encounter. And then as the players explore between them, you can either map it as you go, or you can not map it at all. If, for example, it is a labyrinth of corridors connecting them together, you don't need to map that. You just need to have the players walking through it, give the impression of a labyrinth by making them use navigation or intelligence checks of some kind to guide their way through. In D&D terms, you can give them advantage if they're using things like chalk to mark where they've been or that kind of stuff. Maybe disadvantage if they're doing nothing or they enter an area that's under some sort of enchantment, like the earlier mentioned permanent darkness, or just something that turns their heads around. And eventually when they get, you could use it as an extended check or a skill challenge, and when they hit the level of success that they need, they meet the next encounter area. And you don't need to map the section in between. If they're going back through a section they've already done, you can give them advantage finding their way back to it because they've done it once already. But you don't have to let them, if you want to, you can, but you don't have to let them just backtrack through that, because the whole point behind a maze or a labyrinth is that they are not that easy to navigate. Of course, in the case of a labyrinth, they're designed so that wherever you go, you will ultimately end up in the same place. And it's just what route you take to get there. So if you're doing it as a labyrinth, then that works quite nicely, and it's easier for them to get out, maybe. But you can still decide as they go along. I mean, you can even go, okay, you walk down the corridor for 20 feet, you hit a T-junction. Do you go left or right? You can do it that way if you want to, and either keep track of it if you're that sort and you think that they will remember where they went, or just make it up as you go along if you don't think they'll remember and you don't care, and eventually have them walk into the next encounter area. And this is a good way of not having to bother drawing an entire big labyrinthine dungeon map. and thus streamlining your dungeon. You just care about the key things. In the same way that for a city-based adventure, if you've got an encounter in the palace and another encounter at the blacksmiths and then a third encounter at a house on Candle Street, you don't care about how the roads connect those. You might have a city map that shows how the roads connect those, but for purposes of the adventure, you don't care how the roads connect those. You just go A to B to C. And you could do that in a dungeon as well. Dungeons do not it doesn't necessarily matter. This was done a lot in old school dungeons. This was done a lot when you were trying to complete the map, essentially. Because in the old days, one member of your party would be a mapper. Whether it was happening in character or not, the players would map the dungeon as they went along. This was an important part of the experience for us in most cases, was sitting there while the GM describes the corridors and drawing it down and hoping we've got it right so that we can actually get an accurate map of the dungeon. And then when we've got that mapped out, we know we can say, oh, well, there's a space here, there's a door there we never explored, so let's go back and do that door there. And the GM would not say, okay, so where are you going? Describe your route back. Which the DM would just say, fine, okay, you're going back to that door there, and you don't care what the route is to get there because they know what the route is. They've already cleared monsters. Might roll for wandering monsters on the way back, but otherwise just bang, straight to there. Do the new stuff. That's the interesting part. That's a little bit trickier these days with virtual tabletops and modern playstyles, because quite often, if you're doing a dungeon in a virtual tabletop, you will have the player characters exploring the dungeon, the corridors on the tabletop. You don't have to. There are plenty of DMs who stick to narrative for that portion and just then bring up the next room map. But there is always the temptation to do the whole thing that way and have them moving their corridors, their tokens around. And that's the point where the GM really needs to remember that it is entirely possible to group the party together and drag the whole party to a different part of the map. And then tell people, there we go, ping or whatever, to bring the players to the place where they now are. So that you can say, instead of them having to walk their tokens all the way down through these corridors, you can just say, bam, put them over here, there you go, room 23, that's where you are now. That, of course, is not about mapping, that's about using maps. But still comes under Mappa Monday, in my opinion. So, I think I've whiffled enough about the basics of dungeon mapping for the moment. So let's get into some of the more practical side of things, and we'll do a little bit of mapping. So first thing, this is going to be one of those, I'm going to draw a random dungeon map so that I can just drop that in when I need it in an adventure type mapping sessions, as mentioned earlier on, and I still thoroughly advise people to do those. Game masters should be drawing maps, not all the time, but often, so they can get the hang of it. And the same applies to a lot of other dungeon mastering skills, or game mastering skills, in fact. Building encounters for the sake of building encounters. And if it's an interesting encounter, if it's just 6 goblins and an orc leader, that's okay, yeah, fair enough. It's practice the maths, I suppose. But if you build an interesting encounter when you're just playing about with them, keep it on a file index card or something, or just write it up in Word and save the file. But keep a library of interesting, unused encounters that you can just drag in when you want to write a scenario in a hurry. Same goes for puzzles, traps, all kinds of stuff like that. So first thing is we need to decide how big our dungeon is going to be. So going to the dungeons section here, on the new drawing wizard, we will pick a predefined template and see what our template sizes are. So we have got 1000 by 800 with a dirt background, 200 by 160 battle map shaped, 500 by 400, then we've got some different styles, parchment dungeons, etc. some old school styles. Let's go with one of the symbol set styles, I think. Let's go with a nice small bitmap B 250 by 200 foot dungeon. So, right, there we go. There is our initial. This is a small dungeon. 250 feet is not very big. So, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change my drawing color to white, because I prefer white for this. And I'm going to draw a hex or square overlay. And I'm going to draw this as a square grid, and I am going to set it to 5 foot square grid, because modern dungeoneering, you know, it's expected to essentially be a battle mat or to be able to be converted into one. So let's draw a 5 foot grid over this. So as a battle mat, that's a fair old size. Though it has to be said that 250 feet, which is what the wide edge on this is, in terms of drawing battle mats, is not really that big. A player character who is moving in combat can move 30 feet per round. So 250 feet, it's like 8 turns, 8 rounds of movement. Doesn't take a lot to get outside of that area. So it's not that huge. That said, movement in role-playing game combat is remarkably low. Ask anybody who has done any kind of combat art, you know, whether it be unarmed martial arts, armed martial arts, you know, fencing, whatever, and they will all tell you that one of the most important things is your footwork. And that's because people move in a fight. They don't stand there opposite one another in a 5 foot space each, swinging swords at one another till somebody falls over. That's not the way it works. And unfortunately, role-playing games really don't reflect this well. And that's one of the reasons why people say that, for example, D&D has boring fights, they say. Because you just stand there and you hack away and eventually somebody runs out of hit points. Now, they don't have to be run that way. Honestly, every role-playing game suffers from that problem. No matter how many bits and pieces and twiddly bits they put into the combat system, at the end of the day, it all comes down to I swing at you, you swing at me, one of us will eventually fall over. Unless the players get a bit imaginative and the GM gets a bit imaginative. So, you know, as Dungeon Masters, you should be encouraging your players to do interesting things. For example, as I say, movement. People move a lot in a fight. If you watch movie fights and stage fights, you can see this a lot. Think about something like Luke versus Vader in The Empire Strikes Back, or Wesley versus Inigo in Princess Bride. Those fights range across the whole set of the place that they're based in. They range across that whole thing. They move a lot, and this happens for a reason. It's because when you're attacking, you move forward. When you're defending, you will often move backwards. So what you can do to encourage your players is you can, for example, give maybe an armor class bonus in D&D terms, or apply disadvantage to the opponent. Just knock my green screen loose apparently. If you back up, and that introduces that idea that the attacking character is moving forward and the defending character is moving backwards. It's one of the problems with attacks of opportunity. Attacks of opportunity make sense in that you do need to avoid leaving yourself open in a fight. But particularly in 5th edition, where the only thing that triggers an attack of opportunity is moving out of somebody's strike range, they actually don't really work well in terms of realistic fights. If I'm facing somebody with my sword and he is coming forward with his sword and I want to avoid being hit by stepping backwards, and I can tell you now that in longsword technique there is a specific blow which is literally just a step backwards, then a step forward and a strike. The idea being that you one pace back, one step back is enough that their sword misses you, then you step back in and hit them. Now in there you're not moving backwards, obviously you're staying where you are ultimately, because you just go back, forward and strike again. But the idea of stepping backwards, or in another blow stepping sideways to avoid an attack, is very deeply ingrained in these combat arts. But in D&D, you're penalised for that because your opponent will get a free attack if you take that step backwards. How does that work? D&D 3, of course, gave you the 5-foot step. You could take a 5-foot step backwards. And that encouraged movement in combat to some extent because you would do specific things. So, for example, you might want to quaff a potion. Quaffing a potion invokes an attack of opportunity in 3rd edition. So if you want to quaff a potion, what you're probably going to do is you're going to take a 5-foot step back. You back away from your opponent. You probably do so with your sword or with your weapon in an advanced guard position, while you step back, pull away from them, quaff your potion, no attack of opportunity. Can't step back in because you've taken your 5-foot step. So that's it. That's you done. Your opponent then takes a 5-foot step forward, steps in to attack, as you would expect to do. So that, in that respect, that actually worked quite nicely. But once they took away everything except that moving through a threat space for generation of an attack of opportunity, it actually became the opposite of what it's meant to do. And it created a system whereby the way to be hit is to not run away from the person trying to hit you. If you've ever been in a losing fight, if you've ever been picked on or bullied, you know that's not the way it works. Standing up to them is how you get hit more. And that's what the D&D 5 system encourages. It encourages you to not get hit by staying within the range of your assailant. It just makes no sense to me. So there you go. I mean, yeah, they've got a withdraw rule, but it's not a very good one, and it's kind of pasted on deliberately to try and stop that being a bad rule. So there we go. Anyway, we've got our dungeon here. First thing our dungeon is obviously going to need is it's going to need an entrance. So we're going to need a theme for our dungeon. Is it going to be a natural dungeon? Is it going to be an artificial dungeon? Or is it going to be some combination of the two? Is it going to be... Well, I've already decided it's going to be underground because I picked the dirt or rock background instead of a nice outside green grass or whatever. Although, you know, this could be in a muddy field. It'd be a dungeon in a muddy field. So I think what I am going to do is I am going to start with a staircase. I'm going to have this be an underground dungeon. Oh, that's interesting. Why do I have no available symbol catalogues for staircases? Apparently I have no symbols in this. I may have chosen poorly for my my dungeon style. Because no, apparently I have no symbol catalogues. That's interesting. Let me check this drawing properties. Dungeon symbol set 2A. Yeah. So that's interesting. This is a bitmap dungeon style, but for reasons best known to someone who is not me, it's not giving me any symbols. There we go, they're here, they exist. So let's load the up and down symbol set. There we go, there are our symbols. Why they're not they weren't working initially, I don't know. Something went strangely wrong there. Since I'm actually mapping now, I am going to go to this view. And leave us start with a staircase coming down. So we want that one there. And we're going to put it over here, down towards the bottom of our map. Oh, we're going to fix the snap grid is what we're going to do. Because this is currently snapping off grid. That's a little bit weird. I allowed it to set up. Oh, this is just way too keen. Sorry. I don't hide the Windows taskbar, and this machine is just being way too keen on mouse overs. It's not. It's literally popping up a mouse over the moment I accidentally move too low and go over an icon. I need to find the setting for that and turn it down, because it's just really annoying having to wait until that bubble disappears before I can click where I wanted to click. So I want this. Let's have a 5 foot grid 2 snap. So that should now. No, that's still, it's off grid. Weird. Okay, I'm going to turn the snap off for now. Actually, no, I'm not. What I'm going to do is, since I'm not sure why it's being weird, but it is, I'm going to delete the grid that I drew, and I'm going to redraw it, because you set the snap grid when you draw. So I set a square grid, and I'm going to set that. What's it doing? It's snapping to centers and corners. So why is that? If it's snapping to centers and corners, why am I not able to actually get it to match the grid? Surely that should work. It's a bit weird that things aren't. Turn the snap back on. Is it just that that symbol has a... Oh, you go away. I know the microphone is in use. No, it's not letting me line up with the grid. That is really weird. I'm just going to turn the snap off, because I don't get what's happening there. I don't get why the grid is not working, essentially. Okay, so we've got our staircase down to begin with. And that's going to be to a room. So let's use the room tool. We will add a rectangular room. And this is where I really wish I had the snap. Okay, now that's snapping to the right places. So it's something to do with the symbols. Something to do with where the anchor points, the handles on the symbols are, clearly. I can use the snap for this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw myself this nice rectangular room there. Apparently I'm not going to draw myself this nice rectangular room there. Why did that not draw a rectangular room? Okay, something has gone very wrong with this. I may need to reinstall some stuff, because this clearly isn't working properly. It hasn't drawn me my room properly. Now I've got no fill style on this room. That doesn't make sense. The room tool is not set up with a fill style, so that should be. This is clearly not working. So I'm going to decide settings myself, because I have a feeling it's something to do with the wizards. I found this before, that a lot of the wizards didn't seem to be. There seem to be less overland wizards than there should be, stuff like that. So let's go. It was symbol set 2 dungeon, and it was 250 by 200. So I may need to do a complete reinstall on this. Something seems to have gone very wrong. And we will put this in our gaming folder. And we will just call it stream map. And of course we know it is August 11th because that's Strut's birthday. Stream map August 11. Right. Now, again, as we did before, we're going to go with a white square grid. Draw that in quickly. Square grid, and that's interesting. That's giving me a default of 20 foot rather than the 5 that it was before. So there we go. There's our grid. Do we now have? Yeah, now we've got symbols. Something wrong with the wizard, but this is now working okay from here. Let's check we've got symbols on the other types. Yeah, we have all the symbols now. So let's start once again, and we know that these don't line up to the grid properly, so maybe I won't care that they don't line up to the grid properly. Maybe I'll put it off grid. I'll place it where it wants to be, because I know that the grid works okay. I'm going to do a rectangular room and hope that this time I actually get a rectangular room out of it. No. That's not what that should be doing. That's really strange. Okay, so let's draw a floor instead. Let's have flagstones. So what the room should do is it should draw a floor and a wall around that floor as a single thing. You've got to remember, when you're drawing the floor, this is not drawing a rectangle, this is drawing a polymorph. So I need to actually put all 4 corners in. So all 4 corners, there we go. Now we've got a floor, and I can give it a brick wall, and I'm going to need to turn the snap off for this because I need it to start here, really. Then I'll turn the snap back on so that I can go around the outside of the room. Go as far as there, turn the snap back off, and put it up to the edge of the staircase. So let's turn on the effects so we can see the wall properly. Now we can see the wall properly, and also the background suddenly looks a lot nicer because it's being blended the way it's meant to be. And there's our first room. It's not a very big room. It's 30 foot by 20 foot, which in D&D terms is a small room, and in real terms is my whole flat. And we've got a staircase leading into it, but we've got the staircase the wrong way around. I placed it upside down. So I'm just going to flip that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the rotation tool, select that, turn the snap back on, because I want to be able to pick, and I can't quite pick the center. So let's go there for our rotate reference point, and we'll rotate it 180 degrees. So now I think, no, I was the right way around before. I was wrong. I did in fact have it the right way around. Oh, I'm doing well today, aren't I? So yeah, this is our first room. Thinking in terms of what might I be doing if I were just making up a dungeon or randomly generating a dungeon as I go. Let's think in terms of how many exits is this room going to have? So this being the first room, there's definitely going to be at least one exit, otherwise it's a very small dungeon indeed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll a straight D4 for this, and I'm going to roll that on my new spinner that I picked up at the weekend. Although the problem with this is it spins forever. I timed this at roughly a minute per spin, so because I can't see what the numbers are, so I can stop it and it doesn't matter. I've managed to stop it on an edge. Well done me. Okay, so that's 4. So we've got 4 exits in this room. So let's go to our doors and see what we've got. These are nice, sort of fairly simplistic door designs. Let's go with, it looks like a reinforced wooden door. That would be a wooden door, so let's just have a wooden door. And again, we're snapping to the corners here, but we're not snapping to the midpoint. If I change the snap, 5 foot angle grid to snap. What if I say 5 foot grid? 5 snap? See what that does? Just change the way the snap works. So yeah, this is now snapping all over the place. But I still can't actually snap to the center. Oh, wonderful. Let's go back to where we were then, and just use that, and we'll just have them off, everything off grid in terms of its centering. So we've got 4 doors. We'll put one there. We'll put one opposite it there. We'll put one there, and we'll put one there. So there we go. Nice and simple start to our room. And that gives us our 4 doors. And because of the way the tools work, this has cut the wall when I place the door. So it chops a hole in the wall at that point and places the door in. Assuming that our adventurers decide to check out the side doors first, we're going to want rooms there. So let's, again, we won't use the add room because we know that's not actually working, although I could probably make the relevant selections. Let's stick with flagstones for the moment for these rooms. And we will have a relatively small room on either side. Now, if I were planning this out in advance, I could draw this all as one floor and then put walls across it. But since I'm not, I'm making it up as I go along. I'm drawing each one separately. We go left. Okay, left it is. Well, I've drawn left, so that's cool. I can do that. Let's put a brick wall in going left. Redraw so it looks nice. And then let's roll to see how many exits there are from the room to the left. So what I'm going to do with this one is I'm going to roll a d3 minus 1. So from none to 2 exits from this room. So I'll roll a d6. That's come out as a 3, which is going to be 2 minus 1 is a single exit. Then I'm going to roll a d3 again to determine which wall this exit is in. So 1 for the bottom, 2 for straight ahead, 3 for the top. That's a 3. So our door is coming in at the top. Let's put it there. So there's only one way out of this room. So let's carry on down that way. I could roll something. PC pulls out a sledgehammer. Yeah, sounds about right. I remember doing that in an adventure once where there was a chess puzzle to open a door, and the door was magically sealed and protected, and we couldn't break the door open. And Drutt and I just got fed up with this chess puzzle. Both had sort of impact weapons like maces. So we went at the wall next to the door because the door was protected and the wall wasn't. We smashed through the wall because we couldn't solve the chess puzzle. Useless at chess. So let's see if I have got my random dungeon rules on here. Because if so, I can actually use some mechanics for rolling where we're going. Random mapping. Okay, so room specifics. Right, chance for a first door is no, we don't want that. We want the actual size and shape. Dungeon should judge right. These are the notes rather than the finished system, which is not as useful as it could be. However, so this is how I did this. A basic room size and shape, which is rolled on a per dungeon basis. Yep, definitely basic dungeon overlord fail. So in this case, we have got, let's roll a d10 for this, because I can't remember what the modifiers are, so I'll just do it as an unmodified d10. 4. So small rectangular rooms. Well, so far we've drawn small rectangular rooms, so that's fine. That's good. So room sizes on small +0, +1 or +2. To roll of 4, that is +0. But what does that actually mean? Now, I'm going to have to reread through the proper version of this, which exists in a PDF because I actually typed it all up. But somewhere I've got a roll for the odds of the room not following the stock size and shape when you're working through it. Yeah, no, these are not the correct notes, clearly, because there's a lot missing, I think, like the actual instructions, for example. However, I've got the Simple Fantasy PDF. Ta-da! It'll be in here somewhere. Probably shouldn't have started from the back, but I'm fairly certain. I mean, I know the bestiary is the last thing in there, but I think it's the thing before that. Yay, dungeons. Okay. So +0. The +0 that I generated is the size mod, which is determined based on the room's number, +1 per full 8 5x5 squares. So the default room size on this is actually less than 8 5x5 squares per room. That's really, really small. I rolled low. I'm going to ignore that. So, defining each room in the dungeon. Did I actually include the randomizing, the proper randomization in this, or did I only do the content randomization? I wonder. That's, I've got a couple of systems for generating room content. There's a simple version and there's a complex version. The complex version determines the room's status and utility, and different room types fall within a particular range on status and utility. So, for example, a low status, high utility room might be a garderobe, because it has a very definite function, but it's not really somewhere you want to hang out. On the other hand, a medium status, high utility room might be a laundry. High status, high utility room might be something like a wizard's laboratory, for example. Even with the rules here, without actually reading through them, I can't remember how I did this. So we'll just ignore that, and we will just draw our dungeon on whim. So I am going to go back to drawing some flagstone floor, and what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to draw a floor that runs over the whole of this section here, which is not going to be where this room is, but is indicating sort of a rough area that I'm currently playing with. This is not a dungeon with corridors so far, but we could make it one. We could, for example, at this point, put in a wall there, and a wall there, And suddenly our door heading right, because there's no left here, comes into a corridor. Let's now quickly draw these other rooms in. I'm going to put this one over here matching the one on the other side, because that makes sense to me. And given that it is matching the other side, let's actually give it some utter symmetry at this point. So our opening section of dungeon is nicely symmetrical. We've got the same room layout whether you go left or right, and then that leads on deeper into the dungeon beneath or behind. But I'm also going to deem that this is essentially giving our player characters a false sense of security. I am going to go weird from this point onwards. Now I'm going to slightly overlap this wall. I don't really want to, but I also know that it's going to look very strange if I don't, because it won't draw the corner properly. This is a tip when you're using campaign cartography for drawing walls in a dungeon, that if you draw a line coming in from that direction and a line coming in from that direction, they don't meet at a proper corner. You have a notch chopped out of the corner where they're just two flat ends. If you want corners to look right, you have to draw around a corner and then stop. So either start your walls off the corner, or as I've done here, when you're drawing up to that, just overlap the wall slightly going around the corner so that you get a nice neat corner. I can show you actually what it does if you don't. Let's repeat last command, brick wall, and if we run from there to there, there we go. It doesn't properly give you a corner. You instead have that nasty notch chopped out of it. And I am going to, at this point, need to hide the floors. And the reason I need to hide the floors is because I don't want to delete the floor when I delete that wall that I only drew in as a demonstration. Right, and then I can say don't delete the grid. Then I can do the thing that I always forget until the first time I realize I haven't done it, which is not on the sheets but on the layer, which is hidden behind me. Actually, I can swap to the offset to camera. So layer is just about here. Yeah, just about there. It shows what layer you're on, and if you click on that, it brings up the layer list. And on that layer list, one of them will be the grid somewhere. There we go, hex or square grid, and I can freeze that layer. So anything drawn on that layer cannot then be edited again, and without unfreezing the layer, because that whole layer is frozen and nothing can be done with it. You can add to it, you can draw tools that you can draw using tools that draw to that layer, but you can't edit anything on it. So that stops me from accidentally deleting that grid in future, and I always forget to do that until after the first time I realize that I'm trying to delete the floor by mistake. Because obviously when you click on a wall, you're also always clicking pretty much on the edge of a floor, unless, like in this case, the floor runs between two rooms. So we need more floor, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to swap our flagstones out for cobbles at this point. The corridor is going to mysteriously become cobbled for no good reason when it hits this point. And we will run up some corridor here. Oops, didn't click there like I meant to. Right, there we've got some corridor, nice T-shaped corridor. Let's give it some wall. And we're going to stop shy of the end of the wall. in case I want to put a corner there. And we'll put a wall along the back there. So there we go. There are our flagstones become cobbles suddenly after 20 feet of corridor, and then that heads north into a bit of T-junction. Now I've worked out the rooms down here, but I haven't worked out what exits they've got because we haven't gone into them yet, and we're doing this on our random room generation idea. So we've got a left option here, so we'll assume we're going left because the party has said we go left. So at this point, let's go to, just for fun, let's have that open into a bit of natural cave. So we'll use the cave tool and we'll draw in something that we can kid ourselves is in some way a rectangle. Because this is natural cave, so it's not obviously going to look nice and neat. Now I'm going to move this to the back, I think, because I want the cobble corridor flooring to stretch out slightly into the cave. Now the cave also needs a wall. And this is where we start getting into some fun stuff with the tools. So we'll go with a rock wall. We will start here, we will turn off snap, and we will trace. So zooming in a bit further so we can see what we're doing. I hit T to trigger the trace. Okay, actually first I delete the point that I just accidentally placed. I hit T to activate trace, select what I want to trace, which is our cave. And we're going to start here, and we are going to come all the way around, and we're going to stop there, and that will give us a wall that actually follows the fractal contours of the cave. It gets a bit weird in places, usually gets a bit weird in places, and it has done indeed here because of the way the effects, the 3D effects on the walls interact with this shape. It's usually best to keep the shapes relatively smooth if you're going to put a wall in like that. But there we go, we've got a natural cave now, and we've got a wall in that natural cave. So let's roll to see how many exits we've got. And again, we'll do this as a d4 minus 1. And that comes out at 2 exits. So again, we'll roll a d4. No, we'll roll a d3 rather for south, west, and north in that order. And that is going to be going west for the first exit. And indeed west for the second exit as well. So we've got 2 exits heading west. So what I'm going to do, I don't necessarily want to put a door in, I just want to put tunnels probably coming from here. So in our doors selection, however, we've probably got a cutting tool. We often do, hoping we've got one on this. No, we haven't on this one. That's annoying. But there is a simple solution. What I can do is I can take a door and I can place it in the wall there, which will cut the wall. And I can take a door and I can place it in the wall there, which again will cut the wall. And then I can delete the 2 doors. And a lot of the styles have a cutting tool, which is usually represented by a dotted line, generally 5 foot long dotted line with a pair of scissors in the middle of it. It's generally how that's marked. And that tool does exactly what it says on the tin. You place it over something like a wall, and where you click it, it will chop a 5 foot hole out of it, which lets you do things like this, corridors that don't have a door. Here I've obviously gone with corridors that don't have a door, or tunnels, as they are called in these natural caverns, often. And we'll go back to our cave, default, and we will start drawing out, and we'll get a bit of tunnel coming out here. And I'm going to sort of overlap a bit there because I'm making sure that this doesn't go weird. I don't want the fractal to leave a gap between the two bits of cave. Then again, we'll go back to our rock wall, and what we will use is we will go to the tools and we will select snap to endpoint, which is F5 as the keyboard shortcut for that. So then I select what I want to snap to, which is going to be that bit of wall there, and our first point will be the end point of that wall. So we know that that's going to work that way. And then I'm going to click very slightly off it so that I'm getting a proper corner. Then once again I'm going to trace, and this time I'm tracing this corridor, bringing it all the way down here to there. Then I will give it a point just off the wall and then snap to the end point of the wall, and that should give me a decent, yeah, it's good enough. It's not great. I might need to tweak that first section. At the moment that's a dead end. I can choose to do something with that or not at my whim, but for the moment that corridor runs to a dead end. Do I want to fix this slightly ugly bit of wall here? I could try editing. Nope, that's caught the floor instead, which is not what I want to do. I want to node edit the wall itself, but catching the wall and not picking up on the floor is slightly awkward. Yeah, see, this is a situation where I want to hide the floor. I could freeze it on the layers, but it's easier to hide it on the sheets. I find it easier anyway. You know, your mileage may vary. So let's look at, it's this point that really initially that I need to move. Oh, that's gone very ugly. Move that point. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to delete some points there. Try and smooth that out a bit accordingly. There we go. Deleted a few points. It doesn't look as bad as it could do, but it also doesn't look great. However, if we don't look too closely at it, it'll be fine. I'm a bit of a perfectionist. I didn't need to make that fix, and I could really make that fix better, but that will do me to be going on with, frankly. Now, putting the cobbles leading into this open cave actually works particularly well, because if we look, we can see that the cobbles are basically stones. They call it cobbles. What it really is stones over a natural rock base. So effectively they've laid gravel. It's a gravel path down this natural stone corridor, and they've laid it in as far as the cave, and then they've stopped. They've stopped awfully suddenly though. So let's see whether we can fix that and look and see what we've got in the debris. No, what we got in the cave. Icons. And unfortunately, they don't really match the cobbles, do they? Yeah, much though I would like to use those, they really don't match the cobbles. What if I go with a dark grey and try the vari-colour version of them? No, because they're drawn sort of cartoony, whereas the ones on the cobbles really aren't. So not a lot I can do about that unless I draw in some oddly shaped. I've got the snap turned off at the moment, so I could do that. I could draw in some oddly shaped bits of cobble floor. Just to take the weird, very uniform nature of that away. Now that currently looks horrible because what I didn't do is take into account the overlap. So what I should have done is turn the snap back on, select my cobbles, draw round the outside of the cobbled area, snapping to the grid, then turn the snap off and draw our weirdly shaped section around the outside like so. And that hopefully will merge rather better. It's not perfect, but it is better. And again, you know, it's not looking like, you know, they didn't use a ruler and a set square to work out where they stopped putting the gravel on the floor when they came into this cave now. So to me, that looks much more real. I mean, I could have used the cobble floor in place of the cave for the whole thing, of course, but I like it this way, I think. Interestingly, the alleged flagstones do match the rock design. Weirdly, the labelling on you know, the definition on some of these styles are perhaps a little strange. Don't think I've used this particular mapping style before, or at least I don't think I've used these particular textures before. So probably not used this particular mapping style. Or if I have, I've used different floors. I might have used rock floors, for example, or marble floors, or wooden floors, because I don't recognise these flagstones and cobbles particularly. Okay, so we've got another corridor that needs to come out of here. We'll do that we will do that as our cave. And we are going to place that starting there. We'll leave the snap turned off because I didn't place that in the right place. Okay, so I'm actually going to undo that. That's why I stopped where I did, because I knew I was going to undo it. My initial click for starting position didn't register. So my first actual click was away from the beginning of the corridor, and it was going to go very strange. And I'm going to bring this down around this way, and then back around to here. And again, we'll go with the overlap there, and that will blend in quite nicely when we redraw. And once again, we're going to want to put our rock wall over this. So we will go to our rock wall, we will hit F5 to choose the end point of this, we will move in slightly, and then I think what we'll do is I will manually come around to there, and then I will trace from this point, and I will trace as far as here, and then I will just manually draw it in to here, F5 for the end point, and that should mean I don't have to fix that. It's looking a bit funky there because of the way it's drawing those graphics. Hopefully those won't come out on the export, but I can't guarantee that. So what we've got so far then, we have got the beginnings of a natural section coming off the side there. We've drawn the stubs of those two corridors, the two exits that we randomly rolled for that room, but we haven't necessarily gone any further at this point. Let's come back to the the constructed portions of the dungeon instead now. These almost certainly aren't going to be both dead ends. At least one of them is bound to go somewhere. But I want to map more of the constructed portion first. So back to our cobble floor, because that's what we've been using. Turn the snap back on. And we will come to the end of our section there, and we will give it a room at this point. There we go, and let's give that then a brick wall. Oh, I've just come too far, so I'm going to have to do something about the fact that I've come too far. There's a couple of things I can do here. One, I can move those nodes. Because I accidentally clicked one space too far down, and I've got a bit with no floor there. So there's two things I can do about that. I can move the nodes using the node edit tool. I can just select that node there, and I can move it up, and that will let me shrink that down to where I originally intended it to be. But I'm kind of inspired to instead select the water tool, but the water tool is meant to be a smooth thing, so I actually want to do this slightly differently. I'm going to go to water here, and I'm looking for, there we go, water blue straight. Fortunately, if that didn't exist, I would have created that tool. But since it did exist, I could just do that. And what I've got now is I've got a water trough, essentially, at that edge of the thing, at that edge of the room. It's not a natural pool, clearly. It is artificial. But as a GM, I like to be sneaky. So I'm now thinking, what if I take my standard smooth water, I turn the snap off, and I make this a part of a larger pool which can be accessed only. Oops. Okay, so I'm obviously going to need to fix that. It wasn't what I intended to do. I need to do a quick node edit there. I needed to click there and I didn't. So let's move that node up to there, and then we will send to back on this water so that it goes behind the water in the pool, in the room. So what I've got now is I've got a water cave, and I can draw a rock wall in here. Again, I can use trace to bring this all the way around here. And I am going to, again, I'm going to send to back. It doesn't matter if it selects both things, so long as I get the wall, so that it goes behind the brick wall. And let me just quickly swap over so that you can see more of it by putting a smaller version of me in here. Move that over. So what we've now got is we've got a cave, a pool cave. And if one of our player characters thinks to investigate the water at the bottom of the room, if they stick their head underwater, they can see that it actually opens out into a wider pool. And, you know, depending on how generous we're feeling, we might say that this area here, immediately by the building, is completely filled with water, and that the cave, as it opens up to the sides, also opens up upwards and gives you headspace, breathing space. And I could even put a corridor running off that if I wanted to. Let's find out. Let's go with a D3 minus, no, it's a D4 minus 2, I'm going to say, for my odds of there being any exits from this cave. And there are not. However, it seems like a bit of a waste not to have an exit. So if I were building my dungeon in this map, I would maybe put something in that cave so that we reward adventurers who go swimming by giving them some sort of treasure. Possibly there is a concealed alcove above the waterline containing some treasure or something. Or maybe there's the body of an adventurer who also came in to swim around and explore and got trapped and drowned. And maybe he's got a magic sword on him or something. So there are ways in which your pseudo-random dungeon map suggests ideas for your adventure, in the same way that obviously your pre-scripted adventure suggests how the dungeon should go. We've only got the very beginnings of a dungeon map here as yet, but I think it's already working out quite nicely. It's potentially interesting. At the moment, we've got a sealed dungeon because all the doors at the beginning are closed. There may be another exit somewhere, and the inhabitants of the dungeon might have come in through that exit. They might have come in through one of those tunnels that, as I said, may not actually be dead ends, leading to the Underdark or equivalent. And so you could find that everything in here is like an Underdark inhabitant, or there might be another entrance somewhere, just a hole in a ceiling or whatever, or a tunnel leading upwards to the surface, and there may be some stuff that's come in from the surface in some of these rooms. Or it might genuinely be a sealed dungeon, and perhaps the only things in here are undead. Who knows? I've got room for maybe 2 to 3 times as much map again in the empty space, filling this up as what I've already got. So it can be a fair-sized dungeon if I want it to be. I'm not going to do too much today. I'm going to call that probably enough for this stream. Been going for a little over 2 hours. If you've enjoyed the stream and you haven't been here before, whether you're watching live or watching on VOD, do throw a follow if you wish. Leashing Bar Guests is the channel to follow rather than Fish Not Fish if you want tabletop content. At the moment it's going out on both channels, but it will be moving entirely to Leashing Bar Guests at a later date. And obviously if you have any comments or queries, feel free to find me on the Hobby Gamers International Discord server if you're on there to discuss things with me there. I don't think I've actually got a command set up at the moment for a link to that server. Sorry about that. I will try and get one set up for future streams, but I keep forgetting to do so. So I hope it's been interesting. I hope maybe you've learned a little bit about dungeon mapping. If anyone's interested in it, I wouldn't mind at all, after I've familiarised myself with it. I've not used it for a few years. Actually doing a whole stream on my dungeon design system. I know I have in the past, years ago, about 2013, maybe 2014, I did actually map a dungeon, randomizing it completely using that system as I mapped it. But as I say, that was a long time ago. I was writing the system back around sort of 2012, 2013. But I can maybe do something with that. This map, I think I'm going to save this map for now and come back to it on a future Mappa Monday. And when this map is completed, I will post it on my Ko-fi so that anybody can use it for their own games. That's probably about it for today. So yeah, thank you again for coming. In between now and my next stream, which will probably be Mappa Monday next week, although Drut and I are hoping to do some board game streams in the not too distant future. I bought 2 new board games at the convention on Saturday, and Drut reckons she can set up her overhead camera so that we can actually stream playing a physical board game, which is a good thing because neither of them is available any other way. Well worth checking out, by the way. One of them well, one of them doesn't exist anywhere on the internet yet. Saturday was the launch day, and it's an indie game by this guy. So you won't be able to find anything on that one anywhere. But the other one is Ages of War: Battle for the Bronze Age, which is an interesting card game. It's sort of a skirmish war game played entirely with cards, even down to the fact that the cards make up the board. You put terrain cards around the outside to close in the play area, and you can vary that play area for the size of game that you want, which is kind of cute. That's created by someone who used to work for Creative Assembly on the Total War series of game, doing battle design, and it looks to be really interesting. So I'm hoping we'll be able to stream that in the not too distant future. So, in the meantime, thank you for watching, and may your dice be hot and your characters cool.
1, 2, 3, 4. Whoa. Whoa. The fire's getting stronger.